Thank you so much. Can I just check that everybody can hear me okay and see my slide okay?
Perfect.
Excellent. I'm going to be giving a whistle-stop tour about what has happened to mental health across the 3 months since lockdown came in. And this study has been carried out at UCL. It's called the COVID-19 Social Study. And we mobilised a few days before lockdown started. And since then, we've gathered data from over 72,000 people across the UK. This is included for those who joined early because it's a weekly study. They've now been taking part for up to 15 weeks of data collection. So that means that across the 102 days that we've had since lockdown began, we've had over 500,000 surveys completed, an average of 3,000 to 6,000 every single day. The sample is very diverse and it's weighted to population proportions, and we're analysing the data in real time. So we've already had over 30 reports and scientific papers from this study. So I'm going to be sharing with you what we've learned so far. So my first question has been, how has mental health been affected during COVID-19? Now, if we look at the lead up to lockdown, a number of studies have now shown us that mental health got worse across this period. So particularly in the uncertainty before lockdown came in, it seems that happiness decreased and things like fear, stress and sadness increased. And several papers have now come out showing that by the start of lockdown, levels of mental illness in the UK were already substantially higher than normal. Now, since this lockdown, we've been able to plot day by day what's happened to these different measures. So as you can see, lockdown is shown on these graphs, just on the left-hand side on the 23rd of March. And since then, levels of depression initially stayed relatively stable, but have since started to decrease, especially since the easing of lockdown has started to come in. Anxiety, though, has decreased quite steadily across this lockdown period, and life satisfaction has been going up. However, this is, of course, changes from these worse states that people found themselves in at the start of lockdown. And in fact, we found that around 35% of adults are saying that their mental health has been worse in the last 3 months compared to usual. So whilst we're seeing some improvement back towards normal levels, we don't seem to have reached those normal levels even now. But a big question is everybody being equally affected by this? And the simple answer is no. If we stratify these results by age, we find that younger adults, who are shown here in the pale blue lines, they've been worse consistently across every single measure of mental health across lockdown, whereas adults over the age of 60 seem to have had better mental health across this period. Similarly, if we stratify by household income, we see there's been a social gradient across these experiences too. People in households with a lower household income have performed worse across every single mental health measure consistently. The pattern's the same when we look at mental illness. People who had a diagnosed mental illness before the lockdown came in have experienced worse levels of mental health. Now, this might to a certain extent be expected, but it's interesting to see that these differences have stayed or even widened across this period, across these different measures. And finally, when we look at ethnicity, this time weekly as opposed to daily, so we've got sufficient statistical power, we find that people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds have again had poorer experiences across every aspect of mental health. So the main thing to take away from this is that whilst mental health has been showing some improvements across this time, these still don't seem to be back to normal levels, and people have not been equally affected by this. A big question that is relevant to mental health is loneliness and how people have been socially affected by what's been going on. We compared data from Understanding Society, which is a representative panel study of adults in the UK, which used the same loneliness measures that we used in our COVID social study. So we looked at data in the 2 years prior to COVID compared to data during COVID. And what we found is that many more people are reporting being lonely during COVID pandemic compared to normal. So whereas on average around 8% of people usually say they often feel lonely, this has been more like 18% during lockdown. When we look at who's actually been most at risk for loneliness, we found there are certain factors that are often risk factors for loneliness that have continued to be risk factors. So for example, if we look at age, we find that younger adults on the left-hand side in blue are often more at risk of loneliness, but this has actually been found to be exacerbated during the COVID lockdown. So age has been even more of a risk factor than usual. And we see this as well for income and for people living alone. So in other words, those people who are most at risk are the ones that we might expect, but unfortunately they're even more at risk than usual. The thing that's even more concerning about loneliness is there hadn't really been any improvement over the lockdown period. So we know it's worse than normal, but it doesn't seem to be getting much better at all, with only tiny changes in the last couple of weeks. And again, we're seeing that it's worse consistently across lots of different groups. Another big issue has been adversities that have been experienced because of the pandemic, not just catching the virus, but the other kinds of psychological and social effects that the virus can have for people. When we look at worries about things, then we can see that most stresses have improved. For example, worries about catching COVID, having access to food, and finances have decreased across the last 14 weeks. But unfortunately, we see this social gradient again. So people with lower household income have been more worried about all of these factors. And the truth is they have more reason to be worried about them because unfortunately, they've been more likely to experience all of these adversities too. So people who've got lower levels of socioeconomic position, shown here in red, have been 1.5 to 2 times more likely to have lost their jobs. They've been 4 to 5 times more likely to be unable to access sufficient food in the early weeks of lockdown when there was the rush on supermarkets. And they've been between 7 and 9 times more likely to be unable to pay their bills. The story gets even worse, I'm afraid, because when we look at the relationship between these adversities and mental health, we find that people of lower socioeconomic position are actually having a closer relationship between adversities and mental health. So in other words, they're more likely to worry about these adversities, then they're more likely to experience them, and this is likely to have an even greater toll on their anxiety and depression than people with more socioeconomic resources. So finally, we've had some newspaper articles and stories that have suggested that some people have actually been loving lockdown, and this might seem at odds with what I just presented. So we looked into this last week. It actually turns out only 4% of people have been very much enjoying lockdown, and there are 4 times as many who've been enjoying it not at all. The vast majority, this has not been a particularly pleasant experience. And when we break this down by lots of the factors I've already mentioned, we find that those people who've been enjoying it the most have, unsurprisingly, been between the ages of 30 and 60, living with others, with a higher household income and with no previous mental illness. In other words, they're the group who've been having arguably the lowest risk factors for adverse experiences during this period. So in final messages, mental health and loneliness appear worse than normal during this pandemic. And unfortunately, the pandemic is not affecting everyone equally. Younger adults, people from low-income households, people with mental illness, and people from ethnic minority backgrounds are disproportionately at risk. And there's also a clear social gradient in adverse experiences and the psychological responses to these experiences. A point I wanted to pull out from a policy perspective is that we're actually seeing the same relationship between worrying about adverse experiences as the actual experience of these experiences and mental health. So it's not enough just to think that some issues might not actually happen for a while, like losing work. People worrying about this in the meantime is equally bad for their mental health as when it actually happens to them. But finally, I just want to address why I think looking at mental health is so important during the pandemic. There's obviously the clear issue that if we understand mental health, we can provide better support and guidance to people. But there's also the issue here that mental health is fundamentally linked in with compliance. We've been seeing in our study that people's compliance with the guidelines to prevent the spread of COVID has been gradually declining. Majority compliance, so sticking generally to the rules, is still pretty high, but complete compliance has really gone down. It's down to around 20% in adults under the age of 30. And what we're finding is that mental health is very much linked in with whether or not people are complying with the guidelines. So in other words, if we actually want to stop the spread of this virus, it's fundamental that we address mental health as well, so that people are more likely to comply with the rules. As a final note, we know it's also important to be comparing our findings with other studies from other countries so we get a really rich understanding of this. The COVID Mind Network is a network that I direct, which the Wellcome Trust is funding, where we're actually linked up with over 100 other longitudinal studies around the world, and we're looking at comparing these findings cross-nationally. If people are interested in seeing what these studies in other countries are, then our website is covidminds.org. And if you're interested in seeing any of the results that I presented here in more detail, on our website, covidsocialstudy.org, you can see all of the reports from the last 15 weeks and all of our papers in preprint or published form. And we also send out a regular newsletter as we have new updates and findings. Thank you very much.